welcome to a special edition of Women with Balls, where I, Katy Balls, talk to today's trailblazers. This episode is brought to you by Netwealth, the investment service, and we'll be talking about money through the generations. Do you talk to your children about what they do with their money? Do they understand how to save, how to invest? And do they know what your plan to do with your own savings and investments is? Why is there such a taboo when it comes to talking about money? To discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by two exceptional female leaders in the City of London. They both have over 20 years of experience in the finance industry. Between them, they have 13 children and have been outspoken about working in the industry as a woman. With me today are Charlotte Ransom, the founder and CEO of Netwealth, and Baroness Helena Morrissey, the chairman of AJ Bell. Welcome both. Now, to start, Charlotte, you founded Netwealth in 2015. What's behind that?
Well, having spent 25 years as an investment banker, I could certainly claim to know something about finance. But what I'd found was that I'd been working incredibly hard, earning well, but not really spending any time thinking about personal finance. And then in my last 5 years, when I was a partner at Goldman Sachs and running part of the private wealth business for them, I became very interested in private wealth management generally, and I became quite concerned about the sort of generic discretionary wealth management service in the UK in particular. And partly because I'm British, I was quite focused on the UK, and it just struck me that there was no there wasn't a way that the financial consumer today could really enjoy the benefits of modern technology. So they were still consuming a very old type of service model. And really, the kind of eureka moment came after I retired from Goldman Sachs, and I was sitting at home and I knew I didn't want to manage my own money, but I couldn't bring myself to give it to any of these other discretionary providers. And so it was time to start a new business and really try to bring those two things together, traditional wealth management with great modern technology.
Now, we're going to be talking about the generation gap today, so how, I suppose, children versus parents see this. And I just wondered, growing up for you, was finance discussed much? Was that something?
I think I grew up in a very traditional English household. There were 4 children and my mother and father, and I think it was really not discussed at all. The one thing I can remember is my father getting very energised about the discussion of endowment mortgages at the time that they came out, and he felt that they were absolutely going to the wall. It turned out that he was right. But so intermittent things like that occasionally, but not as a generic subject that was discussed. No.
Have you turned the tide now with your own children? Are you taking work home and making them think?
Well, Netwealth does creep into some of our discussions at home.
Off completely, huh?
Now, Helena, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
You're on my podcast. One of my first ever guests.
It was a highlight of my podcast appearances anyway. So
yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Katie. Fond memories of that.
That's why you're back. Now, you've done a lot of work throughout your career when it comes to women and the gender pay gap, but ultimately also the investment gap. And I wondered, do you think there is an investment gap when it comes to how women approach investing compared to men?
Definitely. AJ Bell, which actually I'm the chairwoman designate. I don't take over as the chair until the AGM, hopefully. Have done some research recently and actually shown that women have less than half the investment and savings of men in this country, in the UK, which is quite shocking, really, because the gender pay gap is not that big. It's about 13% on average. But women are setting aside only £180 a month on average, and men are setting aside over £300. And then women tend not to invest it. You know, they put it in cash, which obviously, as we know, has got very low, non-existent interest rate these days. So it is a big concern of mine, because if we don't invest as much as men, we won't have the same financial well-being. Women tend to live longer as well. So actually, we need to be investing and saving more. So I'm on a mission to try to correct that.
And you have 9 children, so really helping us with the child count for today's episode. Are you starting to have these conversations with them? Are they interested in thinking about finance, in like 10, 15, 30 years' time?
Well, to varying degrees, which I think is going to be a theme of our discussion today. My children range in age from 12 to 30. And they cover all manner of personalities when it comes to their attitudes to money, from spendthrift to really living quite monk-like existences and never seeming to need any money. But I do try to introduce it into conversations. I think it's very much about, though, not just imposing, like, this is money, this is what you need to learn, and making it very dry and academic. It's about bringing it to life and having it as a kind of normal conversation. I couldn't agree more with Charlotte about it being a taboo subject, including within families in many instances, which is missing a trick.
And this is why actually this Netwealth report, which I thought would be good just to open up with before we move to a wider discussion and Q&A, of which please do send your questions on the Spectator TV function in Generation Game, Financial Tribes and Family Finance. To be honest, I find it very eye-opening. You have various tribes in there. I think the slight issue perhaps for me, and probably if my parents are watching, is the ones I'm drawn to, the ones that sound the most responsible, but maybe with time. But Charlotte, I wondered if you could just give us the main takeaways from the report.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned we've been going for 5.5 years now, and over that time we have a lot of people coming to talk to us, and we know that a lot of people want to think about both themselves moving into retirement and making sure that they've got enough for themselves, and then thinking about this question of how do I then make that next bit of the plan, and how do I think about wealth transfer. And it's very clear that it is a difficult subject for many people, and sometimes it's difficult because they're not sure how much they should be putting aside for themselves, and then it often extends to the fact that it's not a natural conversation they don't feel necessarily to have with their children. So it was something that we decided to do a survey of 1,000 parents and 1,000 young adults aged between 25 to 35. And just to get a sense for sort of some of the things that stood out, fascinatingly, less than 25% of those young adult children had ever had an open conversation with their parents about their respective financial plans. And then, interestingly, among the parents, only just over half are thinking of splitting their money equally in their wills, which is probably not something, as far as we can tell, the children would expect.
Yeah, and then the Spectator office was surprised when they heard this.
Yeah, and then
the parents.
Yeah.
And another interesting aspect to it is that 3/4 of the parents felt that their children were pretty much on top of their finances, but their young adult children didn't think that. At least about half of them didn't feel as confident. So what we were exploring in it is that, do you have this notion of a sort of money personality? And is there, if you like, a financial tribe that you might belong to? And I think it does help inform us a bit about how we connect with money. And I'm not going to go through all the financial tribes, there are 7 in total, but for example, there's one that's known as the self-sufficient saver, which in fact is the most dominant tribe that people associated with. And that's where people, they like budgeting, they like sort of planning out their money. It makes them feel safe and secure when they do it. But at the same time, they're always anxious they don't have quite enough. And as a result, they tend to save and not invest. And I thought one of the really interesting things about that is if you look at the ISA statistics, for example, there's over £600 billion in ISAs in the UK, and over half of that is sitting in cash, which is the point that Helena was just making. And that's fascinating because the holding period for ISAs is over 5 years, and yet over half is sitting in cash. And so to me, it was quite interesting that almost half of those adults actually responded that they felt their tribe was the self-sufficient saver, and that seems to be playing out in the sort of national stats in a sense. Another one which is really interesting is one called the wealth skeptic. And this is where you might be quite good at budgeting and quite on top of your finances, but there's this notion that actually wealth and the idea of having excess money is an unattractive or unsettling feeling. And this is something that we do find quite often comes up within families, that they may have parents who are quite well off, but their young adult children, not necessarily all of them, but some of them might feel quite uncomfortable about that wealth. And we might go on to talk a little bit about some of the things we've experienced on the back of that. And then a third one is what we call the head in the sand avoider. And again, I think the financial services industry has a lot to answer for here, because these are people who just find the whole concept of personal finance really quite overwhelming. So they know they should do something, but they find it very hard to engage with. And we do know that in part that's simply because the literature and the regulation and the communication and everything is really made quite difficult for people, and sometimes it does become overwhelming. But overall, the main takeaway really from the report, and I think we know this, is that communication within families and across generations is absolutely key. And we'll probably go on to talk a little bit about how perhaps, to deal with this taboo and to try and help, people get across what they need to do.
And just before we delve into that, Helena, you recently wrote a report with AJ Bell about the gender investment gap. Looking at Charlotte's report, do you see any parallels there?
Well, definitely. I mean, say all of the points that Charlotte says apply to women, more so in many cases than men. As I mentioned, women tend to have less in investments. And so obviously, particularly if inflation is rising, their so-called investments, their savings in cash, are going to see the purchasing power erode. You're going to be able to buy less with the existing pounds than if you invest it properly in stocks, shares, other assets and so forth. So we just see it compounded in the case of women. And I think as well, you know, the point that Charlotte's making about it being a taboo subject, again, I would say women feel, it seems, even more unsettled, uncomfortable about talking about money, or talk about anything else other than money, even amongst their friends. Or if, the only examples I've ever come across have really been when people are in straitened circumstances and feel the absolute need to reach out to somebody. Other than that, particularly in the UK, and we've been talking about earlier when we were waiting to come on about, you know, it's so different from America, where people talking about all the time what they earn, where they shop, you know, how much discount they get, what they are investing in. I started my career long time ago in the late 80s in New York, and everybody had all these conversations all the time about switching their mortgage to something that was more, you know, attractive and would save money, and it was very open. And we need to get somewhere towards that. I don't think we should, I'm hoping we don't go all the way, but we need to start talking about it. We are still British. I think we can go a long way down that road without losing what's, you know, special. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, that 23% figure in terms of young adults the number who say they are having those open discussions. And I mean, in a way, Helena preempted my question, which is, why is it we're so bad at it? Is it a British thing where we don't think it's a done thing, or it's crass to talk about money? Or is it the fact that, you know, often if you are talking about money, it's because you could seem pushy. So as Helena says, maybe if you are going to bring it up, it's when you're in a bit more of a desperate situation.
I think there's a lot of different subtleties to this. I do think it's quite un-British, but I like to think that we're slowly changing that. And I think that modern technology actually is hugely helpful in that respect. But I think also, you know, one thing, for example, is to talk to your parents about when you die. That's not really a topic for Sunday lunch, you know, and the implication of talking about passing money on has some aspect of you passing on yourselves. So I think it's very much for the parents to start introducing this idea, not so much about necessarily their wills, as much as understanding that as you go through different periods in your life, there will be times when it's really helpful to start talking about concerns that you might have and problems that might arise that your parents, you may be surprised to know, can help you with. And I had an interesting example just recently with someone who was saying they actually approached their parents to say, I know my brother needs some money now, more than I do, and I would much prefer that you're able to go and help him. I understand that it may well mean that you don't end up splitting your wealth equally, but I as his sibling, feel that this would be the right thing to do. So I think in this case, the parents were quite surprised, and it helped release a whole sort of torrent of emotion around this subject, which can be so difficult for people to want to talk about. And after that, it sort of just opened it up as being something that actually, okay, I understand now that we're all pretty much on the same page. I think the other thing is that if you're not on the same page, and of course there are going to be situations where people within the family think differently about this, there is nothing better than talking about it, because the biggest problem otherwise is, you know, maybe for the person whose money it is, they may have passed on, but they leave that problem to children and maybe grandchildren, and they leave all sorts of possibility for family disruption that could actually have been sorted out had some of this been addressed earlier on.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because, you know, the number of legal disputes over family legacies hit a high in 2020, I think. Yeah. So you can start to see, and I just wondered, I suppose broadly, maybe you, Helena, what kind of problems do you think do arise if you're not talking about what money someone is likely to receive? Obviously, you never quite know what's definitely going to happen.
Well, there's an emotional issue around money, whether it's inheritance or just, you know, having enough to live on and so forth. I think for all of us, there's some sort of emotional baggage that comes with, you know, our money situation. I think, you know, I mean, it's going to sound rather dramatic, but the question that you don't ask, and obviously isn't implied by parents not necessarily giving equal amounts of money in their wills or, you know, to their children overall, it doesn't mean they don't love them equally. And I think people will assume sometimes, oh, that this, you know, they'll read into the silence and it might not be at all clear. I thought it was fascinating, Charlotte, in your report where there were all the different reasons given. And when you read through it, yes, only half of parents roughly were going to give equal amounts to their children when they die. But actually, some of it was about making things more equal at that point. They might have given a gift during their lifetime and so forth. So again, I think you can end up with terrible emotional upsets and people falling out when already they're dealing with death and, you know, the loss that comes with that. So, yeah, it seems so obvious. I think people just shy away from talking about death and money, and you put the two together and it's, you know, a double whammy in terms of actually having that conversation. And I don't think it is for every Sunday lunch. It's for, you know, like my dad said to me the other day when I was leaving visiting his house, he said, you know, I just need to talk to you about, you know, my will and money and, you know, what I'd like to do in terms of gifts over the next few years and so forth. And he was the one that broached it. And we had a really, you know, I didn't want to think about it in some ways, but he was right to.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting when you crunch down the figures of those who are not planning to, you know, share inheritance equally, that you had, you know, quite similar numbers saying, I'm going to leave more to my child who's the most responsible. Well, yes, and also some of them saying, I'm going to leave my money to the child who's least responsible.
Yes. Yes. So any children watching or young adults, get responsible or give the impression of being responsible quick. So.
Exactly. But I suppose one of the things, Charlotte, is one of the calculations, I suppose, and Helena just touched on it, is a lot of people will be wondering whether they should be doing gifts, you know, spreading out potential inheritance or going to the end. What kind of factors should someone consider in those scenarios?
Well, this is actually, I think, a really interesting point because, of course, there is some tax efficiency to getting your plans in place early. And I would argue there's some absolute joy in terms of getting some of these plans in place early and in giving while living and seeing your children benefit from it. So there is this 7-year inheritance tax sort of window, if you like, that you need to gift money and it's only after 7 years that it falls fully outside of your estate. And so it is always worth starting to think about the gifts that you want to make and making those plans. And you can only do that if you know, of course, how much you're going to need yourself. And like I said at the beginning of the discussion, I think this is one of the things that hold people back because they're anxious about starting to gift if they haven't really yet figured out, okay, within my estate, how much of it do I need to hang on to for myself, for my spouse, you know, whether we may need care home fees to pay or whatever it may be. So there's a lot to be said, first of all, to make sure, and it actually doesn't matter what age you are, I would say. I mean, if you're in your 50s or in your 60s, and even if you're not even thinking about retirement yet, maybe it's still 10 years away or 15 years away, it's well worth starting to just make an assessment about, okay, so if it were 10 years time that I retire, how much money do I think I would need? Have I got sufficient, you know, have I got sufficient with a extra bit on top? And now let's think about, can I start to have these conversations with my young adult children and start to help them get set up with their first flats? Or, you know, can I help them think about something that maybe is worrying them and pay off those student loans or whatever it might be that's bothering them? And I think that this concept of starting to give while living is actually quite a powerful one. And it does tend to presuppose that you're having conversations with your children, that you trust them, that you trust that their partners are going to be people that you feel confident over time, that you're happy that whatever decision they make will be one that you will stand behind, because you lose control, obviously, of your money at that point. So actually, this question of control is one of the other things that holds people back, that they're anxious that should they start giving it and circumstances change, and the lovely girl they thought their son was going to marry suddenly disappears and somebody else turns up that they're not so keen on. But that's being a family. You know, and you know, as Helena was saying, there's plenty of emotion that goes with that. That's nothing to do with finance, of course. But I think if you can start to get yourself organised, it is just a tremendous amount of relief, if nothing else, to just have that sense of, okay, I know where we stand. And I can now make that decision about starting to give. And I can think about some of those subtleties that we just covered. But I'm in a position where these conversations can start happening.
Now I'm going to start on some audience questions shortly, so do keep sending them in. It's just in the SpectatorTV function. But just before we get there, I wondered, one of the things that I suppose might put a parent off, whether it is an immediate gift or telling their child how much they are, eventually going to get is a worry. It could demotivate them. In a way, you want your child to be working very hard to make money on their own terms, and then perhaps have a nice surprise when they find themselves in a better position later down the line. Helena, do you think there's a way to tackle that? So, because I wonder, I don't know if you feel it as a dilemma yourself when you're thinking about all 9.
Yes, all 9 is quite a daunting prospect if I'm going to be equal and, all that. But so I do think it's a question of tailoring to the individual. This is something we touched on briefly and you mentioned in terms of the tribe. So again, I think there are certain people who probably would think, okay, hang up my boots, I don't need to try so hard, and are very, perhaps, less motivated as human beings, to work hard. And then there are others that it would clearly make no difference to, and they would treat it responsibly and so forth. It does, the clear message coming across is, okay, give your parents the strong impression that you're very responsible with money and that you'll carry on working really hard. But I think it comes back to really how you bring up children, because clearly even the wealthiest, we see this often, obviously, billionaires saying that they are not going to bequeath their wealth to their children. They want them to make their own way in the world. Most of us want to help our children out and for them to have a slightly easier path in life than we might have had. So finding your own way there and making sure that they understand this is not sort of a replacement for your own achievements in life. That's just part of parenting, I think. But there may be 1 or 2 people that you have to hold back a little bit and make it a little bit secretive until they are responsible enough to make their decisions for themselves.
Maybe something I could add to that, because I think it's something that we've seen, and it's actually a really interesting thing about when you make a decision to give. This is when it becomes so important to know the type of personality your child has. And the example I wanted to give is that we actually had a father who had decided to give each of his children a pretty significant sum for their first house. And it turned out that of his 3 children, 2 of them put that money towards buying pretty lovely houses for themselves. And the 3rd one gave it all away to charity. And, it's fascinating. The father was very upset. He hadn't expected it. One could say, well, it was laudable of this young adult to take that view and to think that actually someone could do more with this than me. But one of the things that was very striking to me was not just the father's surprise, because it does seem to indicate that they didn't necessarily see the differences between how their children might behave. But the other thing is that young adult child probably also didn't appreciate what the options are to do with a significant chunk of wealth. So let's say they felt, well, I can go and live in a flat perfectly happily for 25% of that money. Actually, if they'd understood that they could have taken the money perhaps and put it into a charitable trust and then have something which over time would go to good causes, but that rather than having to chuck a massive lump sum at something where, you're never quite sure that's all going to go to the cause that you might want, but actually let them learn through experience about how to give and how to live with wealth, both have a roof over their heads and do the sort of thing that really matters to them. So this is another, I think it's a great example and a true life example of things that happen.
Going through the tribes, am I correctly diagnosing that person as a wealth skeptic?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. And because I just briefly want to talk about investments, and actually it touches on a bit, which is, do you notice a generational divide, or is that too simple in terms of the type of investments, whether that is, a single goal, someone has when it comes to money they've made or inherit, or actually the fact they want to do it in more kind of worthy environmental factors, things like that?
Well, there's no doubt that the whole move towards socially responsible investing is something which has captured the imagination, in particular, I would say, of millennials. So sort of people up to the age of, say, 35, 40. We definitely see that that's much more prevalent in let's call it, the younger generation. But I think also, inevitably, older people have slightly more complex financial lives because they're thinking about mortgages, they've also got school fees, they might be, if they're older, thinking about retirement planning, they may be thinking about divorce. There's a number of things that go on as you get older which wouldn't necessarily be on a sort of typical millennial's plate in the same quantum. And this is actually where I think technology is so very helpful in terms of helping people, I always call it, get closer to their money. So in other words, have a mechanism to allow them not just talking about money, but actually interacting with money beyond a budgeting tool, but actually to think about investments and how they line up with what you're trying to do. So most people at Netwealth and at the sort of, if you like, at the parent level, will have several different goals that they're thinking about and investing towards. And what that means is they will have different risk levels that they associate with those goals that they're trying to achieve. And that actually, and for women in particular, we've found that that's hugely powerful to help them, envisage how this money is being put to work, as opposed to it just sort of being put into just a one pot and kind of fingers crossed that it does what it's meant to do.
Well, I would just add, because I think that you mentioned about technology being such a sort of enabler, I think it also helps people just get started and exploring about money. Because again, our generation, wasn't taught anything systematically anyway at school or in the classroom, in any walk of life really, whether at university and so forth. I think that there is some these days in terms of life skills that my youngest, who's 12, particularly enjoys, where they do talk a little bit about budgeting and debt and so forth. But mostly, a lot of the reason why people don't get started investing, particularly women, is they say they just don't know how. So having online resources, having apps, we all used our banking apps now, aren't we? So that we look, maybe not daily, but very frequently. We've gotten the habit of looking at money issues. And again, apps can really help just in terms of keeping track. You can start small. You can start with £10 a month. You don't have to have £10,000 to get started on investing. So if anyone's watching who hasn't ever invested before, you can just take one step at a time and get used to it and see what happens to your money and then keep adding. Overall, time in the market is much better than timing the market or trying to.
Yeah, because I was going to ask Helena on that, just in terms of, I suppose, more likely to be younger individuals, but you never quite know. It's almost encouraging for people to take this long-term approach. And I think particularly when you are, whether it's, late teens, 20s, early 30s, you're 5 years seems like quite a long time to a degree to put some money away, given all the things that could change, let alone 10 years, 15 years. I think it can seem almost a little bit overwhelming. And I wonder, and it goes back to the study in a way to a degree, the fact that parents tend to almost take a more positive perception of having control that younger people than they personally do. So how do you think you can get people to think about that when people are really quite worried about the day-to-day?
So I think that even though everyone says, and it's true, think of it in terms of a 3 to 5 year horizon at a minimum when you're investing in risky assets like the stock market. Obviously, your money isn't, unless you invest in very illiquid things, your money isn't locked up. You can access it. And again, people get sort of recklessly cautious about this. They sort of think, I just might need the money. And so never get into the habit of investing on a regular basis. If you start and then you find, actually, I'm not missing that £10, £20, £50 a month, and then you have a pay rise, and you think, well, I haven't had that before, let me just add that in. Then suddenly you'll look and you'll have a really interesting, sum of money that you could do something like put down a deposit for a flat or buy something that was otherwise unaffordable. So I think just trying to not always see what might go wrong. And I say that being very conscious that markets are very volatile at the moment and there's lots of uncertainty, but there always is. So if you just get into that habit, the only regret I have in my investment life is not starting sooner. Once it got started, there were things that didn't go well and so forth, but just get into the habit, treat it like physical well-being or your mental health. You kind of do things every day. These days we're all very conscious of just trying to eat reasonably healthily or, walk our steps, which I failed miserably in the cold today. But
yeah, I failed on the stairs.
Yeah, the stairs helped today. We had to come up the stairs.
I'm going to go to lots of questions coming in. Any more, do send them in. Try and get through as many as possible. We're about halfway through. So here's one. I'm worried my child seems to spend money as soon as it comes in. Is there anything I can do to encourage better habits so they make more of what I leave with them? Which I suppose is touching on that anxiety that, whether you leave your money equally or not, is it going to be used well? Charlotte, what do you say to that?
Well, so it sounds as though this child falls into the big spender category, which is actually quite often something that you might find when people are younger, because it's also a bit of a novelty. You don't tend to have much money as a child, so whatever this parent is giving their child, they obviously are kind of excited about it, and the behaviour they're demonstrating is they're then finding ways to spend it. I think it goes back to this idea of trying to, if we're thinking about people listening tonight, thinking about this notion of communication and how to get families and a cross-generational communication going. What you want your child to understand is what the options are of what they can do with that money. So a little bit like Helena was saying, if you can help them understand, if I were to put some aside, what might I do with it? What might it do for me? And it becomes actually much more exciting than, you know, rush out and go and spend it straight away. So to me, that's really what I would suggest.
They don't mention how young or old the child is, but I'm going to just suggest if it's a young person, a genuinely young person like my 12-year-old or so, I highly recommend getting a Go Henry card. I'm not on commission. I just have nothing to do with them per se, but it's a great debit card effectively, but the parent's in control, so you can see what they're spending. You can pay them allowance each week and you can quiz them. You know, you say, I see you spent X amount of money on bubbleology or whatever, which is topical because that happened today. So then, you know, they're only allowed one a week. It's a bubble tea. You're only allowed one a week and now you've had two. You know, how does this? And you can actually start talking in real time, pretty much. And it's a great device, you know, because the parent stays in control, but they can monitor the child's spending habits. And I can monitor my big spender versus my, what's the extreme caution one? Never spend. No, well, no, and she's not wealth skeptic. She's just like would never spend a bean, you know. So,
yeah.
And it's quite interesting because I pay them the exact same allowance, and I show them. There's a pie chart that comes up with their spending and what they spend it on and so forth. So, if you're a parent of a younger child, get them a Go Henry card and teach them good habits.
Or if they're a teenager.
Or a teenager.
I could maybe do one of those actually, and I'm not.
There may not be an age limit. I don't know. You need to have a sort of parent figure to see.
Charlotte, how much should we be offloading our cash now to our children before we die and they're hit with inheritance tax? Which I think is a dilemma lots of people are kind of juggling with.
Yes. So it goes back to something I was saying earlier, that I think don't start offloading your cash until you know how much you're going to need. Yeah. Because it would be very awkward to start giving it away and then suggest that it might be given back.
Before you even go any further, I might bring in this question which completely touches on that. I think we can do a best of both here, which is we are in our 60s and would like to pass on some of our money to our sons in the next few years, but want to keep enough to be comfortable in our retirement and provide for nursing home care should we need it.
Yes.
So how much you keep, because it's almost tying in that, isn't it?
Yes. So we work a lot with clients on exactly this problem. And I say problem because it feels like something which is maybe quite difficult to understand, because there you are in your 60s. You may last until you're 80, you may last till you're 90, you might be, you know, one of the lucky few that's going on past 100. And during that period, inflation may go up, as we're experiencing right now. And, you know, you may find that investment returns change quite dramatically as well. So there are quite a lot of variables, and one of the things that we talk a lot about is control the controllables. And by that I mean, okay, you can't control your longevity, you can't control inflation, you don't know how long you're going to need the money for, but you can actually model for all of those things. And then there are some things you can control. One is be invested, which is what Helena was talking about, you know, be in the market, don't try to time the market. Make sure that you're making use of all your tax wrappers. And then thirdly, make sure you know how much you're paying and that you are paying, you know, you are not paying through the nose, because there really are ways to access now wealth management in a much lower cost. And that starts to have a really material impact on this pot of yours that you're now thinking, okay, how much should that pot be to last me through, as this questioner is asking. Once you have been able to work through that exercise, and as I said, you know, with the help of advisors and modern technology, it is actually quite a simple exercise to go through, then you can start to think about, right, great, I can now start to think about moving money on. And in this case, you know, they're in their 60s. It's a perfect time. I'm guessing they've probably got children in their 30s or in their 40s, so they've got time to watch them enjoy the money, benefit from it, you know, buy a bigger flat or move out to the country or whatever it is that, you know, that they would like to help their children do. And I think as well, you give the taxman that much less to play with at the end of the day. So there's everything for families to think about, trying to start moving this discussion along and moving the wealth along to prevent the taxman getting more of your estate than he should or he could. I say he.
Well, it's taxman, isn't it? But no, I 100% agree with that. I mean, I think that the modelling thing sounds daunting again, but if you can't do it yourself, and you can really, if you have Excel on your thing, and you can factor in, you know, what you actually need to spend per month, and you can factor in a growth of investments, you can do quite a simple thing, but just work out how many, you know, how much you need per year, and then without knowing how long you got, you can, you know, make an informed estimate. And then, yeah, the sooner you can move anything excess out, then obviously the more likely you are to preserve it from the taxman.
Now, this is an interesting one on developing good habits. Helena, I'll come to you in this one first. Some of my children are big on investing in stocks and shares, others aren't. How do I get them started?
So,
I've seen the apps on your phone.
Yes, I think it is about finding something. So we all learn. I think everybody has a way of learning and having their interest piqued, and it could be through videos, it could be through watching a program, it could be through, you know, this kind of discussion. AJ Bell's just doing podcasts where they're talking to women this is about women investing, particularly real life women, you know, who don't necessarily have endless wealth, but who've got started investing. There are lots of different devices now just to work out, first of all, what excites the person that you're trying to excite. Don't give them a great textbook that, you know, is going to send them to sleep. And then perhaps discuss, again, going back to Charlotte's point about, you know, make it tangible, show them what they could do if, you know, they had some money, invested it and it grew at a certain amount, what that would turn into. I think most people don't understand compound interest, and their eyes will glaze over this idea, you know, if you get a dividend from a share, you can put it back in and it would grow, and suddenly it all becomes much bigger than you might imagine if you just thought, oh, my returns might go up 5% each, my money might go up 5% each year. So I think make it real, you know, use a real life example. I'm not sure what to say. It's suggestive. All else if that fails. But I think just make sure that you are tailoring your approach to that person's personality.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of younger people, I'm going to start on because being a cryptocurrency is something that lots of young people are very excited in. Do you think that there's a point in engaging with that when you're trying to get young people interested?
I'm quoted in the last week in some newspaper for saying it's like a casino, and I do worry about it myself for being very speculative. But if it gets them talking, and if it gets them thinking about, actually, you know, I could take some money and it could get bigger or it could get smaller, then you've got a hook there. And then you want to translate that and say, well, that's very risky and it might go up or down, you know, X, you know, percent at a time. These are the other things that you could do with your money that would just mean you could perhaps sleep a bit easier at night. So whatever it is, to get them sort of at least interested.
To what degree, come to you, Charlotte, would you recommend family investment companies in addition to or instead of trusts as a way of passing money from one generation to another?
Yeah, I mean, they've become quite a popular vehicle. And the reason for that is that they're less complicated, that the costs are lower for setting them up. And they're quite nice because as a parent, you can retain control because you have the sort of golden share and you are the controlling party within the family investment vehicle. But your children are shareholders of the company as well. So it's actually quite a nice way, I think, and we work with lots of families who are starting to do this, where you start to involve your children in this wealth transfer discussion, but as a parent you retain a lot of control and you can then change the level of the different shareholdings, if you like, and the control a shareholding has over time. I think the other thing that's happened is that while they were relatively new a while ago, they have become less new and therefore the costs are continuing to go down, whereas for trusts, although you do have complete control, they can be very expensive to set up and they're really quite inflexible. And there's also a sort of, a tax consequence that you still have to do a sort of tax mark to market at a certain period after the trust's existence as well. And you have to have trustees, and therefore you're bringing in third parties, and that becomes expensive as well. So I'm actually quite a big fan of family investment companies.
Why isn't personal finance taught at school?
So it is part of the curriculum now, but often, again, done in a slightly dry way, I think, from some of the materials that I've seen. I think that we should push for it, and I think there should be a sort of little bit of a collaboration here between the private sector, firms like Charlotte's, AJ Bell and so forth, contributing to that. I mean, I think there have been various initiatives, but it's been a bit... there's a lot of schools and there are a lot of year groups and there are, we've had COVID or we are having COVID. So I think we have to get to that point where we say, look, this is so important as a future life skill. It seems to me that we don't necessarily teach children all the important things and obviously be able to manage your money and get into those good financial habits, looking after your well-being, even as a student. I mean, it really hits young people quickly when they go up to university, or if they do that and suddenly they have to budget or manage the debt, and it's quite daunting if you haven't had any experience. So I think we should do more. It's in secondary schools at present. Again, I think start young, get people used to it. It's just another subject at school, and bring it in. It's often taught as part of maths. Again, that works sort of, but not if you hate maths, If
you switched off the class already.
Exactly.
Because also, I think it's one thing that's touched on the report, which is the idea that you do. Is it fair, Charlie? A lot of our financial habits we do learn very young.
Well, yes. I mean, Emma Maslin, who worked on the report with us, who's known as the money whisperer, she reported that it's actually from the age of 7 that you start to, you start to mimic your parents' habits and start to kind of have a sense for how you might interact with money. But one of the things I was going to say, which really makes me feel that we do need to establish financial education kind of across the academic system, if you like, is that we run something called the Young Investor Day a couple of days a year at Netwealth, and that's for young adult children of clients, and they basically get a sort of full half day of interacting with investing in its different forms and starting to understand some of the language, some of the sort of the rationale for why you invest, why markets go up and down. And then they actually, we do some simulations with them where they're running money themselves or they're running money on behalf of somebody else. And what I love about it is that, A, we have as many, girls and boys or men and women come, and they come from every single background in terms of what they're studying. So it's for people who are about to go to university through to those who've graduated. But we have historians and people who've done modern languages. We have physicists. We have biologists. We have psychologists. It's really wonderful to see how they engage. And actually, one of the bits of feedback we get from the parents then is, my gosh, they're now telling me what I should be doing with my money.
What you wish for, huh?
But it is this thing of sort of bringing it alive and making them realise that it's not as intangible as it might seem, and that it actually, dare I say it, can be quite fun.
Any of your children of the 13 you got giving any of you advice yet on what to do with your money?
Well, I have one teenager who is very interested in, following lots of companies and doing shares, but also in crypto, and is nagging me all the time about being more adventurous, so far.
Yeah, well, on that,
I'm holding out.
There's quite there's a question here saying, my sons are investing a lot of their money into cryptocurrency, but I am far too risk averse. Am I going to be missing out in the future? I'm guessing you may say to this, Helena, the answer is no. What do you think?
Well, I mean, obviously crypto could, and obviously there are different cryptocurrencies and so forth. You might make a lot of money, but you also might lose a lot of money. So that's where people, and obviously what we're talking about here is, I think, planning and not just sort of betting it all on black. Which I worry that where we're at and the maturity of crypto we're at. But Charlotte might have a different view.
Well, I'll tell you my view on sort of crypto and other kind of wacky things, which is, I like to talk about this thing called the 3-pot theory, because I think we all have sort of 3 pots that we live by. So you have your liquid pot 1, which is your salary or maybe dividends or rental income or whatever it is. And out of that pot goes your daily outgoings. So that's your sort of current account. And then pot 3 is for either illiquid things or volatile things. And so in the UK, it's always, when you're up to a certain age, it's your house or your homes. And then it might be, if I worked at Goldman Sachs for 20 years and I was paid in Goldman Sachs stock, so it might be a concentrated stock position. It might be things you enjoy. It could be fine wine or classic cars or crypto. And in that pot is where you will forgive these assets for either being long-term and illiquid and sort of high friction costs, or for being volatile because you enjoy them and they have the potential for high returns. But what I would always suggest is that don't forget about pot 2. So if pot 2 is where the bulk of your money should be, sitting in a diversified portfolio sort of managed by, hopefully some experts who can produce what I call sleep well returns. So inflation plus a bit or a bit more, depending on how much risk you want to take. Then do what you want in pot 3. And enjoy it. And if you lose, 100% of the money you put on crypto, it doesn't actually matter, and you've learned from it. But it's important to put it in perspective.
It's a good way of putting it and looking at it. Now, I've got some quite spicy questions coming in. I'm enjoying this one, which is, why should we leave money at all for our children? I mean, you don't have to. I think that's worth pointing out. Do you think there's an argument that people should, or is each to their own, Charlotte?
Well, I have only 4 children compared to Helena's.
Not shabby. It's not shabby at all.
and you know, I think it is actually, there's a very interesting point about whether it is good for children to inherit, which you were touching on before. So I actually have quite a bit of sympathy for parents who are saying, hang on a minute, you know, should I be giving my children money in any material sense? And I actually think it can be quite overwhelming and quite off-putting for children to certainly to have too much money too soon. But there's no, you know, one of the things that I think children might say to their parents is, you know, enjoy your money. I mean, please don't scrimp and save and have a terrible old age because you're giving it all to us, you know. So I think, you know, so flipping that question around, I would say, actually, I imagine that depending on what that means for you as an individual or as a couple, if it's going to be really tough to pass stuff on, I should think your children are open-minded enough to think, OK, I get it. You know, mum and dad need to have that roof over their heads for quite some time to come, and I want them still to be able to go away and have a summer holiday as well.
Now, we've been talking a bit about getting younger people, whereas, you know, teens and others into investing or starting to think about it. But we have a question here. As a 70-year-old woman, how do I go about making my first investment? Who wants to go have a go at that?
So I guess
I don't want to cast aspersions, but it might be the app is the way, but it might be
different.
different.
I mean, I think obviously we need to know a little bit about her in terms of whether she wants advice or whether she wants to pick her own stocks or whether she wants to, you know. So, I mean, I'm going to obviously declare my interest in AJ Bell, but, you know, you can do either there. We don't offer advice, but we offer, you know, you can do it yourself, and it's very straightforward. If you're a beginner investor, you can go on the website, and there's all sorts of resources to sort of teach you about what you might need to know before you start parting with one penny. Or you can get a financial advisor, which might suit if someone is sort of taken up until now to think about it and might want the guidance and reassurance that would come with working with an advisor. And so I think it's just a question of, first of all, finding out enough information and not rushing headlong into thinking all investment's good or all investment's bad. It's a question of just making sure. And actually women, all the research suggests, which I think is a good thing about us actually, we haven't got a very gender balanced panel here, but anyway, we should have that we don't like buying anything or investing in anything that we don't understand. And that's good news, I think. So first of all, work out what you are comfortable investing in, and then lots of resources on various websites, not just AJ Bell's, for them.
And I think just hopping off that, there's a question which is, you know, if you are going the wealth advisor route, perhaps, you know, you do want to get that expert advice rather than go it alone. What's the best way to find an experienced wealth advisor?
Well, I'm, you know, really quite biased on this question.
Not quite biased, Pam.
Because there is, you know, I have to be careful here, but there are websites who use that exact word, and I would argue are really not unbiased at all. So I think you have to be really careful. I am the ultimate cynic. That's why Netwealth exists. And I have real concerns about how little financial consumers are really able to get to the bottom of how much they're being charged and what indeed they are being charged for. So I think you need to be very careful. I was recently asked by somebody whether or not they should be taking any notice of you know, influencers who are starting to be increasingly active in finance. And, you know, one of the interesting things about that is they were inevitably they were on the pay of somebody who was asking them to sort of channel inquiries towards them. So I think it goes back actually to knowing what you're looking for and knowing what questions to ask.
Well, that's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it,
well,
sometimes, because it's hard to know.
It can be, but I think if, you know, most people at some stage in their lives do need advice. I mean, I'm actually quite a believer you don't need it year in, year out, but that you do probably need it if you're thinking about retirement or if you've had a divorce or, you know, if your, you know, circumstances have just changed dramatically for whatever reason. And I just think that there are a number of things you have to be very careful about. And probably the single biggest thing that can influence your outcome is paying too much. What people don't understand is paying an extra 1% every year in fees, which is typically
the rate you're giving your
the rate you're paying your advisor for their, not just their advice, but for managing the assets and so on. That 1% every year, which is typically the amount when people come over to us that they are overpaying by until they find us, that over 10 years that will impact your capital by 14%. So on £1 million, you are giving away, if you put it that way, £140,000. Or on £100,000, you're giving away 14,000. It's a colossal percentage of your own capital that you don't need to be giving away. So it's really catch-22, because I really feel for people that the right thing is, I understand why people want advice and need advice, and I think it's important. I mean, in our case, we offer advice. The other thing I would say, though, is I think advice should be offered both hourly as well as on an annual basis, so that if it is actually something you want to, if you like a mark to market, you should be able to just pay for whatever it is you need and then move on. But that would be my advice.
Helena, I just wonder if I could bring you in. What questions do you think someone who hasn't really done this before should be asking? Because I haven't invested, perhaps one day, but I've seen the graphs when they talk to you about investing and say, well, this is what risky is, but it ends very well eventually if you just do it long enough. And you're looking at the graph and like, okay, but is this going to be my graph?
Yes, well, it usually isn't going to be your graph. I mean, could I just add quickly on something that Charlotte was talking about in terms of how do you find an advisor first? And then I'll sort of try to weave in and answer that. So I don't know what you think about pension-wise, the government's offering, where if you are looking, this might not be the relevant point of entry for someone asking, but if you're looking to sort of work out your pension situation, in my case, several years ago, even though I worked in finance, I had didn't spend enough time on my own personal finances, had lots of pensions pots scattered around, and I just thought, I just have no idea what to do about this. Pension-wise is a government facility, and you can book an appointment with somebody, and they go through and give you some pointers for the next steps. And actually, in my case, they gave me a link to where I can find a financial advisor in my area and so forth, and I contacted a few, and I agree with Charlotte 100%. You need to watch out for the fees. And actually, I based my decision partly on who was very upfront and clear about the fees and very transparent about that. So I think if you start there, if your query is about pensions, it for me was a very good way of then, so some of my lockdown time, eventually sort of drawing that all together. So the other question was, now I've forgotten, I've talked too much. What was the other question, Katie?
Just in terms of the right questions to ask when you're meeting with that wealth advisor. Now, I think it can feel quite intimidating if you're not someone who feels like a fae with,
So I think the goal is that you want someone who understands you, who understands, what your level of knowledge is, who understands what you're trying to achieve, who understands your whole financial picture as far as is possible. And to do that, they shouldn't be just arriving with some charts, saying this is what will happen if you put some money in this, that, or the other. They should be spending time getting to know you and building a picture, and then you should be contributing to, what they tell you. You should be saying, so I don't understand how the stock market works, and I don't understand what a share is, and so forth. A good financial advisor should be listening and should be talking you through some of this. Don't buy things that you don't understand or get sign on the dotted line of things you don't understand, and do ask for more information if someone. Just don't be talked at or talked to,
Don't be bamboozled.
Yeah, don't be bamboozled. And I think actually, again, sorry to generalise, but I think often women are very wary of being sold to. I run a mile if someone is trying to sell me something. I want to make the decision myself, but I sometimes need the information to help me do that. And if you don't know what to ask, just don't rush into something too quickly. Spend time getting to know whoever you pick as your financial advisor.
Now, we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to try and sneak in just 1 or 2 questions with quick-fire answers if possible, which is, how do you pass money to your adult children but make sure they are protected if they get divorced? So I think it's obviously about potentially, exes, getting hold of inheritance. Charlotte, any thoughts on that one?
Well, I mean, one thing is obviously the legal route and prenups. And as I understand it, they are much more common now than they used to be, which is sort of scary. And I know for some people that would be just an absolute abhorrent idea, but it's something which if a divorce lawyer was sitting here, that's what they would be saying. I think in some trusts you can organise it in a way where potentially there is the ability to keep a certain amount separate, but it becomes very difficult, particularly after someone, if they've been married or in a civil partnership for a long time.
And then all my money is tied up in assets like my house and car. How do I decide who receives what in my family? And you have 9 children, so I'm coming to you based on this. Probably, you don't have any cars you have.
No, I haven't. I mean, my car situation is not going to get anybody anywhere, I'm afraid. So we have gone through, our eldest son got married a few years ago, and actually we thought, let's, help with the house and let's take some money and hopefully we'll survive 7 years. I think we're down to 3 left to do, so far so good. But we have been looking at a home that we've worked out how much it's worth, and therefore how much can we afford to give to children, and actually been thinking about, because more of them were getting married, selling it, and starting the process and moving to a smaller place.
And here's just an interesting question, perhaps to end on, which is, any thoughts on skipping generations?
Yes.
So is this something you hear much of?
Yes.
And that is ultimately, is that going straight to the grandkids?
Yes. And it's actually, it's a great question, in fact, because, what you don't want is to be contributing to your children's estate, if you like, if they already have sufficient amounts of money, and it is then taxed on them, and they will potentially already be higher rate or additional rate taxpayers, and you can instead pass it straight on to grandchildren, and it can be very efficient. I mean, you can do it in the form of junior ISAs, or you can do it in bear trusts, and it's a great way to help your children without it necessarily touching them. And so it's something that we see a lot of, and I think it's a very sensible idea.
And it's very in sync, I think, with the reality that, we've had some boom times, and now it's much harder, I think, for young people, genuinely young people, to make their way in the world. We're not all expecting our children and our children's children to be wealthier than us. So I think this is a great way of helping to improve the intergenerational transfer of wealth.
And just, I love sneaking in questions. I think the team probably, I'm going to get a lot of noise in my ear in a minute. But I just wanted, because we've been talking a bit about how women particularly can be a bit more cautious on this, and obviously this is the Women with Balls podcast, I wondered, there's one question saying, which apps help women learn to invest? Or it might be an app, but I wonder if there's any particular tools you think factor into the fact you might be a bit more, you might not want the hard sell and things like that.
So I feel that it's a bit biased for me to say this, but AJ Bell has just launched Money Matters, which is a growing sort of set of resources. So I would point you there. And actually today, because it is news off the press as it were, we've just announced a new app called Doddle, D-O-D-L, which isn't launched until the first half of next year, but is designed for people who want easy, cheap investing, and something like that. I don't think that's the only game in town, but something like that just sort of brings you in and makes it straightforward.
I suppose what I would say, what our experience has been at Netwealth is that almost 50% of our clients are women. And that's really interesting, because in the discretionary wealth industry, typically it's more like 25% women, because of the scepticism and because of their sort of lack of interest in, really engaging with finance. So I think, we've managed to bring together, I was talking about the technology and the humans together to make this something which is just more appetising for women, and I'm delighted.
And we need more women working in finance, clearly, because that might be something to do with it.
I need to thank you, but just before we do, I wanted in one sentence, if you could each give me your best advice for those who are watching this, when it comes to what we've been talking about, whether that's investing, saving, leaving something, or choosing not to leave something if you don't want to. But what's your best advice when it comes to having something to save or invest?
Well, I would say, take the bull by the horns. And face up to the fact that this needs addressing. You can decide to give or not to give, but don't put your head in the sand. Take advantage of the fact there's all sorts of different ways, as we've been discussing today, to try and get to grips with this very important subject.
Sadly, mine's the same. It was going to be get started. If you're dithering, if you're not too sure about it, just do it and, take it one step at a time.
Brilliant. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in today to this special episode of Women with Balls. I want to thank my guests, Charlotte Ransom and Helena Morrissey, and thanks to our sponsor, Netwealth, for making it possible. You can watch back the session, recommend it to others on replay when the show ends, or you can catch it on the Women with Balls podcast feed from The Spectator. So thank you for watching, and I hope you join us again.